Matthew, thank you so much for doing it and welcome to my podcast.
Dheeraj, it's great to be here. Thank you for having
Super.
me on.
Absolutely. So, Matthew, I wanted to dive straight into some deep questions, which have been troubling my mind, and I've been wanting to debate them with you, right? One is when we look at the brand construct, right? I mean, how brand thinking has developed over many, many decades. I often feel and worry that we have been hugely reductionist, right? So the whole thing of saying that, oh, you know what, consumers don't get much. Your proposition has to be single-minded. Let's just all brands need to stay for just one word in the mind, and so on and so forth. Whereas if you look at consumer behavior, right, brands get built over a period of time through multiple messages, tapestry. They get built in layers, right? It's like people, right? I mean, if I say Matthew, it's not just one word I think about Matthew. I think about a whole set of emotions, layers of experiences, and so on and so forth. And I would imagine brands would respond similarly. So I wanted to pick your brains from a behavioral economics perspective. Have we simplified things far too much? Have we made it simplistic? Have we reduced things more than required? And how does the brain really work? And what could we learn from there?
Yeah, and I think it's a really great point. I mean, so there is obviously benefits in simplifying things and making them easy. We know that cognitive ease is a very important thing in terms of people remembering things perhaps and actually sort of recalling them at the right times. But I tend to agree with you. The first thing I would say is, who builds brands? And I'm going to go back to Jeremy Bullmore, who was the chairman emeritus of WPP, who before that was the long-serving creative director, which is what chief creative officers were called back in the day, and a managing director of JWT in London. And he said, and he used a word I don't like, which is consumer, but he said, consumers build brands like birds build nests. Yeah. They find little bits and pieces all over the place and they bring them together. So the first thing is, who builds the brands? Well, a brand construct is unique to everybody and it is built by the receiver of the messages rather than the brand itself. And so you want to make that process easy and rewarding for people. And I think where the ease thing gets a bit confused, and I went back and forth. There's a great creative director, in fact, founder of an agency in Chicago called O'Keefe Reinhardt Paul, called Tom O'Keefe. And he and I worked together over the years. And he used to have this maxim, he used to have this saying, which was simple enough. And what I really like about that is it's saying it's not just about simple. Simple enough leaves room for richness. It leaves room for sort of things that surprise and delight to some extent beyond brutal simplicity. And I think it also works with the way the brain works. I think the mistake that we sometimes make is to think that it's about simple information. But really what we're trying to do is we're trying to make connections simple. I mean, what the brain really does, it just connects information. It connects things to the things we know already. And what you're really trying to do, I think, is facilitate those connections more than just create a simple structure. Brands should be rich. I mean, brands exist as memories, and it is those memories that lie in our brand to help us make decisions when we want to make a decision that uses that information. One of the things that I talk about a lot is that the role of a brand, I see a brand a bit like a heuristic, a bit like a cognitive shortcut. A brand's role is, for my mind, from a consumer perspective or from a chooser perspective, is to make choice easy, natural, and rewarding. That doesn't mean that doesn't mean the brand itself needs to be devoid of any complexity, but it means that the brand needs to kind of fit into when you're making choices to be able to be recalled easily, to actually provide the rewards which are relevant to the emotions of the category. But it's not just about, I think, brute simplicity. Making something easy for people, ironically, and any designer at Apple will probably tell you this, is not easy. It's not to make things simple to use actually requires often a lot of complexity. And I think that's what we have to remember as we design the the pieces of brands that people will then take and weave together and create their own brand experience, their own brand memories, their own brand associations.
Yeah, no, fantastic. You're saying we have to make it easy for the people to construct the idea of brand. Doesn't essentially mean that everything, all messaging we send out have to be simplistic. They have to be rich for people to be provoked, to create imageries, associations, conversations, connections. You have to have that rich tapestry in the brand.
I think you do. I think you do. And this is not to say, and I'm not sort of squashing my foot on simplicity, but I think the problem is, and I think Einstein wrote some stuff, I mean, had many, if you go and look up quotes of Albert Einstein, you will find tons on simplicity. And I won't get it exactly right because I am no Einstein. But I think he sort of talked about this notion that simplicity was not just about being simple. And I think what he was really trying to say was that sort of people are oversimplistic in their definitions of simplicity. So, I think it's a long running debate. As I said, it's something that Tom O'Keefe and I have debated many, many times over the years. He uses that great beginning, and I will get this slightly wrong, of a short story by Hemingway, which is children's shoes for sale, $6, never used. And his point with that is that there is so much richness. I mean, that is a very, very simple, concise thing, but it could take you to so many places. And I think that's the key. I think that's the key. What I don't know if you use the same analogy. I often talk about bow ties when I'm really sort of getting something down to a fine place. The point of compression, and I think we talked about this previously. There's a great planner, Russell Davis, who would talk about the role of a creative brief is to compress, but still keep all of the richness and the nuances in place. And I think if you're getting stuff, the analogy I use is like when you compress music. Remember how bad MP3s were, but Apple lossless compression compresses, but it allows the richness to come out the other side. And I think that's what you're trying to do. I often talk about it as making something brain-sized, making a problem brain-sized, making a planet-sized problem brain-sized. So that's kind of what the role of simplicity is. So that it can fit in the brain, so you can walk around with it, it can hang around and pop out at the right times. I love Google's purpose of organizing the world's information. It's wonderfully simple, but it is also potentially so rich. You can take that to as many places as you want.
So stretchable. It is so stretchable.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, it is. And I think that's sort of the whole thing about that sort of the beginning of that Hemingway story is that you've got 6 words which are there and you can comprehend them but they can expand into many places. And I see the same with behavioral insights. I mean, human nature is a very, very complex thing. Behavioral science is very complex. And I think it's really important for us as practitioners to compress it into something which people can work with, but then they can expand out into the use occasions that they're looking to, the different contexts that they're looking at, with richness and with the ability to still inspire. So I think having gone around the houses on this, I think the short answer to your question is compression and simplicity are very, very good, very important, as long as they allow you to expand and to be inspired afterwards.
Yeah. I mean, that also, I mean, an adjacent conversation, Matthew, is, I mean, a lot of categories, they want very, very deep involvement with consumers, right? I mean, we often get a brief in advertising, this category is low engagement. Can we make it high engagement? But you know what? People don't want to engage. People don't want to engage with an insurance guy. I mean, it's okay. I've done you. Please go. I don't want to engage with my electricity utility supply guy as far as it's working, right? So it's not important. It's not important for all brands, for all categories to be high engagement. In fact, what we figured when early days of when we were building Amazon in India, Matthew, we figured that people would come and we would have a lot of people falling off because they got inundated with the abundance of choice, right? I mean, they really didn't know what to buy. So for example, if you go to a neighborhood retailer, they'll give you 5 choices, but they'll also tell you, buy this. This will be good for you. They'll recommend. They'll help you, they'll help facilitate choice making. And therefore, I often feel a large part of marketing actually is reducing the friction. Rather than increasing the friction, right? I mean, friction reduction, except for a few categories. What would be your thoughts on that from a behavior perspective?
Well, I think it's very, very connected to what we just spoke about.
Yes.
I mean, we talked about simplicity. I think, I mean, the thing that I have learned the hard way is that there are no golden rules.
Yeah.
And this is actually, I interviewed Robert Cialdini, a famous behavioral scientist and author of Influence, which was kind of the first real book on how, experimental psychology had given so many keys to persuasion. And I interviewed him and he said, one of the things he said he was working with somebody who was looking for what is the sort of the silver bullet, what is the one thing? And he said, after many years of research, he'd emerged to believe there is no silver bullet. It is all silver buckshot. And I kind of like that expression because it's the idea that, yes, there are lots of little things you can use which may have a bit of magic, but they're not all going to work at the same time. And they're not all necessarily going to, and certainly not going to deliver that killer blow. And I think sort of to tying the two things, the thing we were talking about before and our engagement that we're talking about now together, I do think it is. I grew up in Ireland, and Ireland's a big racing horse community. As people would say in Ireland, it's horses for courses, by which they mean, you can't set a golden rule.
Yeah.
Sometimes engagement is good. Sometimes simplicity is good. Sometimes friction avoiding friction is good. Sometimes a bit of friction actually is a very helpful thing. And there's 2 areas, I think, where friction or disfluency, as it might be called by behavioral scientists, can help. One is there's evidence that with luxury brands, actually a little bit of complexity, making it a little bit difficult for people to fully know the brand, or to make the brand a bit, the brand is almost, it's like in a courtship, it's playing a bit hard to get. It is not, you have to do a bit of work as the chooser and as the potential user. And I think this is interesting because it kind of fits. I mean, my hypothesis is that this might be a very valid point, because with luxury brands, you're looking for something which is making you work a bit harder. It's an aspiration.
Yeah.
You almost appreciate that little bit of distance. Your everyday is not generally a luxury. In fact, by definition, if something becomes everyday, it ceases. If you are bathing in champagne every day, that ceases to be a luxury after about a week. It's probably not a great idea anyhow.
I worry about you.
Yeah, I was going to say, but bathing in champagne may not be a great hygienic process either. So and I think it's the same with engagement. You have to think about when are the times to engage people and when are not the times to engage people. Some categories thrive on simplicity. I think if you are, as a rule of thumb, if you're an everyday low interest purchase, keeping it simple is a really, really probably a good thing. But it is not the rule that I wouldn't say it is what you should be doing in every case. And with engagement, I think, you said you don't want to engage with your power company. Well, generally you don't, but there might be areas that you might want to. If they are looking at a big green initiative and you're interested in that, you may be very keen to get involved. And so it's kind of a question, I think, of sort of working out where might be the places of the potential for engagement and where not. And I think there's a further thing as well, which is really that engagement, I mean, it's not quite as bad now, but 10 years ago, engagement was the buzzword. Everybody was trying to increase engagement in every category. We were all aiming to get sort of consumer created content. We were sort of trying to get people to essentially do our jobs
always
for us.
Present brand, 24/7 brand command centers.
Exactly, yes. So 360 brand as well. I think, I remember, I can't remember who it was, but one planning director from New York, I think it was the planning director of of Lowe and then went to work with Frank Lowe at Red Brick Road. He said, it's not about 360 degrees, it's about 36 degrees or maybe even 3.6 degrees. It's about choosing, which I thought was a very insightful comment. But, so when you're working with, when you're trying to get engagement, I think you have to sort of think, there's a great quote, which is $1 of, think about attention as money. And you've got $1 of attention. How are you going to spend it? Well, I wouldn't spend it having somebody do a puzzle on the back of my box of cereal if that wasn't going to move me, if it wasn't going to move them behaviorally in the right direction. And so I think the critical thing to think about with engagement is it aligned with your behavioral objectives, or are you just doing it for the sake of engagement? And, so really you have to start with, well, what are my behavioral objectives? What are the barriers? What are the choices I need people to make? And what are the things that are getting in the way of those choices? And, how indeed might engagement work? One of the things I talk about in my book, and I'm not even sure that AMG Mercedes did this because they went through that process, but I still think it's a fantastic idea. Most performance car brands now allow you to go and learn how to drive like a race driver. Or certainly learn how to drive in a more performance way than most drivers are currently capable of. I think this is a great idea because it's obviously it's engaging. They actually charge people for it, so they're making money out of it as well. But it also perhaps makes people feel more confident as drivers. It improves their self-efficacy as drivers. And I would hazard a guess that feeling like a better driver might be an important condition for somebody in the choice process of choosing a higher performance car. So that's an example, I think, of where here's an engagement activity, which is linked to a behavioral objective.
Yeah, it's a fantastic version of a test drive, right? It does such an amazing job of it.
Well, it does a test drive, but I think, it's not just about the brand. It's about how the person feels. And, one of the things I think is really important that marketers don't spend enough time thinking about, and the conversation I'm having with so many people at the moment, is how do you improve people's decision confidence? There's a thing called decision-making self-efficacy, which is essentially, how do I feel? How confident? How good do I feel at this choice? Because ideally, in most cases, apart from the really sort of simple everyday ones, you want the chooser to feel like an expert. Yeah, I think we spend a lot of time as brands trying to be the expert ourselves, but actually kind of moving that skill to the person who's choosing this. Exactly.
So talk a bit more, Matthew. I'm interested in this whole idea of decision confidence. Can we delve a little bit more into this? How should brands go about building decision confidence?
Yeah, I think, there are ways you can, there's a number of studies show that you can build self-efficacy, by giving people questions to answer, but making it so those questions are not, you don't want to make them, sort of the most stupid, simple questions in the world. An example I often use is if you're a cell phone company and you're trying to give people greater confidence choosing plans, a question you might ask is, which uses the most data, streaming audio or streaming video? Yeah, we know the answer, streaming video, but getting that question right makes me feel a little bit more of an expert. Yes. And this is connected to self-efficacy. There's a lot of interesting work that looks at, in fact, there's an area of, and I can't remember the person who did it, but I wrote about it in my book, which is she was researching learned helplessness. And one of the things that in her, it was I wouldn't call it an experiment, because really you can see the video on YouTube. She got her class, she divided her class into two and gave them 3 acronyms to solve. Sort of one of the acronyms was, half of the class got an acronym which was completely unsolvable. And the people who were struggling with that performed much worse at solving actually quite straightforward acronyms later on in the process. So if you can sort of give people a little bit of help and build their confidence up,
Yeah.
This is a win-win. This helps people feel better about their choices. It helps them feel better about themselves, but it also means they are, going to be more adept choosers. They will probably make bolder choices, and they may make those choices more quickly as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Matthew, I want to change gears a bit, and I want to discuss the idea of change, right? I mean, in markets such as India, right, we're a developing economy, first, second flush of consumption, across categories, across brands. We are, in fact, talking about new behaviors. So we are talking about new behavior on music streaming with Spotify. We're talking about new behavior with e-commerce, with say Amazon or Reliance Retail. We're talking about new behavior in sanitary pads. So across categories, in fact, almost every day, we are trying to convince people, consumers, to shift to new behaviors. We are actually sellers of change more often than not in our market. But our learning also, Matthew, has been that the best way so far to sell change is through realms of familiarity, right? So if I go and tell people that, what, the best, here's a new fancy way to do shopping in town, and it's technology led and it's Amazon, they will get scared. So instead I went there and we said, it's your apni dukan. Apni dukan in English means it's your own shop. It's like your neighborhood retailer shop, right? It calls you by your name. It gives you new options. It takes things back without asking questions. And so we likened it to a very familiar behavior, right? And across the board, we're realizing that if you want to sell something new to this market, you attach it to something very, very familiar, right? Now that's difficult because more often than not, the marketers or the business guy would say, hey, you know what? I built something new. I want to go out and say, here's a new thing, right? Please buy, change your behavior, right?
So I want to be new. I want to be the new. I want to be the thing which is above comparison.
Yeah. I mean, I'm different. I'm new. Why would I want to lose that opportunity to say I'm new? But you know what? Consumers don't buy new. They want familiar, right? So I want to pick your brains from a behavior economics perspective. What are your thoughts on how do you sell change? What are the best ways? How do you latch onto a brain and make this frictionless?
So change and or innovation, which are subtly different things. There's a great paper which I think anybody in marketing should read by a Harvard professor called John Gorville. And it's either called The Curse of Innovation or The Innovation Curse. I can't remember exactly. And it was a paper that had a profound effect on me because he described the scenario exactly as you've described it here, which is that people who are bringing innovations to the market typically only think about what their product, how good and new their product is, and how different it is from the existing status quo, and how it will change people's lives positively. They never tend to think about what people might feel losing from moving to this new product, and the fact that people's baseline is in an altogether different place, which is with the things that they're familiar with. And so I think I think there's two components. I think familiarity is a very important part, but I also think understanding what people might fear losing by adopting the new behavior or the innovation or the new product that you're talking about. And this is a most wonderful, so one of the things you can see behind me is this behavioral lens construct. This is a model I use in my consulting work. And it actually ties very neatly with many of the things we've been talking to. It's a way of compressing and simplifying much of the things that we've learned from the fields of behavioral economics and behavioral science, but actually allows you to then expand them out, just as I said, and apply them to different situations. And the idea of the lens is the L stands for loss and how loss affects our choices. This is not just, and I really have to make this clear every time I talk about it, this is not just about sort of using loss as a way of getting people to buy your product, like saying it's only available in the, for another, it's the classic thing the airlines do.
It's not FOMO, it's not FOMO,
It's not FOMO. This is really about understanding how a fear of loss may be holding people back. The E, which you can see over there, is for ease, which we've talked about. The N is for now and near. This is about proximity, both in terms of time and distance, and how those affect our choices, how those affect our mindsets in terms of decision making. And the S is for social and self. And that is how the behavior of others affects us, what we feel other people are doing, but also how we feel about ourselves. This gets to the self-efficacy we talked about, to the decision-making self-efficacy. It can be how I want others to see myself. It can be about how I want to protect my self-concept. So that's a model I use. I talk about it because I think when you're trying to get people to adopt new things, the irony is, and this is sometimes a difficult conversation to have with the inventor or the chief client who's bringing this innovation to the market, is what might people fear losing? What might in their gut be something which is nagging as a sense of potential loss by adopting this great new product, which is going to change their lives for the better? And in the workshops I do, I mean, people have come up with hundreds of phrases of really interesting things. Many of them are cultural. It can be a cultural thing. It can be about youth. It can be about sort of a sense of feeling healthy. It can be a lot of times it's about agency or about mastery. Often we're trying to get people to adopt a new, if you're an organization, you're trying to get people to adopt a new working process. Well, they've been kind of getting along fine, developing their own processes, and you're taking that away from them. And even if what you're offering, what you're suggesting, what you want them to do makes their job easier and your company more productive, they may feel they're losing a bit of their own self-identity, a bit of their own self-concept as masters of a process. So, it's a really, I think so. So one of the things with change in general, and the Goreville paper is a fantastic paper. It's 8 pages long. You could read it in the time I've been talking about it. And he kind of talks about some of these things. And one of the things he talks about is, of course, sometimes with change, if you can actually make it so that there is no option but to accept the change. He talks about, one of the examples he talks about is how the Canadian government has been more successful at introducing a dollar coin than the US government has been, partly because the Canadian government bought out the coin as a replacement to the paper dollar bill, whereas the US government bought it out as an alternative to the US dollar bill. And in the US, they've failed numerous times. I think they've pretty much given up now. But so I think sort of that does relate to familiarity, because one of the things you would be losing sometimes with a new product is you lose that familiarity. But you can also use that familiarity as a tool to bridge this gap between the baseline that the innovator, the inventor, the chief executive of the company, the CMO sees as the offer of their product, and where the consumer is, where the chooser is at the moment, where their status quo is at the moment. Because familiarity can help you shrink that gap a little bit. So I think, it's a really important thing. It also relates to cognitive ease as well. It's amazing how in these conversations,
it's coming back to it.
Going back to things. It does. But, in my model, in the lens model, I talk about using comparisons. I put that in the bucket of ease, because really what you're doing is you're helping people understand the benefits of something or how something can help them by comparing it to something they already know. So it's a fitting with an existing mental model. So they don't have to construct a new mental model, as many behavioral scientists, including Iptum and Simonson, have said. We are cognitive misers. He says we're cognitive misers who are addicted to comparisons. And he says if you put two washing machines, if you ask people to evaluate a washing machine, they will not have a clue where to start. You put two washing machines next door to each other, and suddenly you probably can't stop them. They could probably be making comparisons for a couple of hours. And the point is that and this goes back to the notion of connections that we talked about earlier on, which is, it's not about necessarily creating something new. It's about how do you connect to something that exists already. And that I think is exactly what you're talking about with your approach to how do you make an innovation feel familiar? How do you relate it to an existing behavior, to something people know already, so they don't have to build a new mental construct?
So essentially, we're saying that the brain is a lazy thing, right? I mean, we don't want to move our brain much unless required. Welcome back, Matthew. Matthew, I want to discuss a bit about indecision for consumers, right? You talk about indecision, and what's the science behind indecision that as marketers, business brands, we should be aware of, and what advice would you offer? What could we learn from this whole thinking?
So, there are many, many reasons for decision uncertainty. I mean, sometimes we tend to forget there are actually very rational reasons for decision uncertainty. It's not just sort of to do with intuitions and instincts. You talked earlier on about, decision uncertainty can be fueled by having too many choices. Yeah. It can also be fueled by having too few choices. Yeah. And so this again is one of the things that even the notion of having, there's a number of, one of the first books, in fact, one of the first people I spoke to when I became interested in behavioral science 20 years ago now nearly, was Barry Schwartz, the author of The Paradox of Choice, a very good book. But I think, what we've learned subsequently, I think his work got people to readjust and to understand that sometimes you could have too many choices. But it is not as simple as that idea of reducing choice suggests. So decision uncertainty can be, as I said, can be having too much to choose from, too little to choose from, not feeling confident in your choice. This goes back to the whole area of decision-making self-efficacy, to feeling that you have mastery of this area. Sometimes having to make a decision in a hurry. Sometimes it actually really forces us to make choices that we may regret afterwards, but sometimes it means that we just kind of, if it's not a choice we really, really need to make, we may walk away from it. So, uncertainty is a really important thing for marketers to understand. And I think a lot of it probably comes from a cognitive bias, which I relate in my model to loss, which is ambiguity aversion, which is that we tend to avoid situations that are ambiguous. There's been many interesting experiments in this area, but when a level of ambiguity is in choice, people tend to not be, it's not that they don't make the wrong choice, they actually tend to avoid making a choice altogether. And there are things that, you can do. So I think sort of, again, one of the things I ask people, organizations I work with to do is to take what I call a choice-centric approach. And when I say a choice-centric approach, this is not to say, I'm not going to knock the idea of being consumer-centric. Of course, that in spirit is a good thing, but to some extent it misses the point. Because the critical thing you need to focus on as a marketer is the choice that you're trying to get people to make and everything that surrounds that choice. And if you do that, you may find that you can understand a bit more about some of the ambiguity around it. Hyundai in the US had a really not very good reputation about a decade ago. It's probably about 15 years ago. And one of the problems they had was that nobody really knew. It was kind of, you go in and buy a Hyundai, you didn't know how much you would be able to sell it for in 4 or 5 years' time when you decided to buy a new car. And the Toyota and Honda salespeople who were the direct, who were probably the closest thing to, although Toyota and Honda at the time would have disagreed with this, but they would have been also in that choice framework. The salespeople at Toyota and Honda dealerships would really make a load of this. They would say, you know what? Yeah, the good thing about this is Hondas hold their value, Toyotas hold their value. Hyundai, who knows? And so one of the things Hyundai did, they did a whole lot of stuff around taking away uncertainty when it came to choosing a Hyundai. For example, they did, I think, a 100,000-mile drivetrain guarantee or something like that. They basically sort of, and that's a pretty obvious and straightforward thing to do, but it helped. But the other thing they did was they guaranteed the resale value of your car. So they said, you know what, we're going to tell you that you have this car, you put 40,000 miles on it, and you come back in 3 years' time, we're going to give you, I don't know, let's say $9,000 for it. And actually, if it's worth more, we'll give you what it's worth, but we will give you at least $9,000, and that's in the contract and signed. And this was a great kind of circular thing, because by doing that, they actually increased what's called the residual or the resale value of the cars. But it actually gave the purchaser a great deal more confidence. It removed the ambiguity in that choice.
Yes.
They did a number of other great things. They also did a layoff thing when in 2008, when there was like a huge recession and many people were losing their jobs, they did a thing where they would give you layoff insurance. If you got laid off, they would buy your car back from you.
Yeah.
But the particular one I like is that resale value one, because it really got at this critical aspect of ambiguity.
Yeah, no, amazing. So Matthew, we've in your lens model, right? I'm now very curious about the lens model, right? So we've discussed loss, we've discussed ease. You spoke about N as near. Is it similar to what Byron Sharp talks about mental availability and physical availability, or is this different from that perspective? Let's talk about
a little
N.
bit.
Yes.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think sort of, one of the things I always explain to people, whenever you produce something which is an acronym with 4 pillars, people say this goes in this pillar, this goes in this pillar, but there is a lot of movement between things. I mean, sort of social proof we talk about as being, it's obviously about the behavior of other people. It actually makes choice easier as well. So it kind of has a role in making choice easy as well. So for me, so yes, it does relate a bit to mental availability. But I also think mental availability is a little bit more at home in the ease area. It's when something comes easily and quickly to mind. So now near is and these the different aspects of this model are more relevant, or more, I would say, more prominent in some choices than others. But now and near gets into things like temporal discounting. Recency bias. It gets into things which have got to do, so the now part of it gets into things which have got to do with time. So when you're trying to get people to make choices which have long-term horizons, one of the things that one has to think about is, well, how can you give them something that is emotionally rewarding in the short term? One of the big issues, I wrote a piece recently, about a year ago, which was in the World Economic Forum's health section, with a famous cardiologist. We wrote together about his sense of how behavioral insights could help his work in as a practitioner. And one of the things we talked about was how in healthcare, very often we focus on both the long-term benefits and what I would call about doing good, something that does you good long-term. Whereas as humans, we're wired to respond to something that makes us feel good in the short term.
Yeah.
So very often when you're trying to get people to embrace a long-term behavior or do something which will give them long-term benefits, they will certainly agree to that, but they won't necessarily follow the behaviors. But you can help them, you can prompt them by giving them something that makes them feel good in the short term. This, my Apple Watch, which many of us have, is a great example of that. I mean, sort of give me a little haptic feeling on my wrist when I've closed my rings. I've realized that's what's motivating me to do that. I'm not thinking about losing 3 kilograms or, sort of my overall fitness. I'm really thinking about getting that little reward. And so that's part of the now or near thing. It's about encouraging people to think about, marketers to think about, well, where does this choice fit in terms of timelines? Where are the benefits? What do we need to do now? And then the near is proximity is often an important thing in choice. This does relate directly to lots of the stuff that Byron Sharp talks about. Many brands have actually considerably improved Coca-Cola for years had this idea of being like arm's length away, always arm's length away when you were in the store. That's a great example of how being near, physically near, is really important. We also know that proximity can affect trust as well. I mean, again, if you're a luxury brand, you might want to be far away. But if you're sort of if you're a brand of toothpaste or something, you might want to be nearer and closer. So it's really about sort of proximity temporally, proximity physically, and how those things can affect choices.
Yeah, it's like, one of our clients, HDFC Bank, right? Almost the entire brand has been built through proximity, right? Because they are branches and they've been very solid. Very little advertising, actually, largely built through behavior, visibility, and proximity. One of the very strong, solid bank brands in the country, right? Because you saw them everywhere, you saw them doing the right things, and that's how the brand has been built.
And also,
Yeah.
it goes back to your point about Amazon as well. You talked
Yes.
about Amazon being your, what you've done there by making it your local store is you've bought it nearer. So that's a very good example.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And nearing improves trust as well.
Yeah, I mean, so it's more of frequency and recency, right? I mean, if we meet often, we kind of begin to like each other, and likeness gets to trust. I mean, that kind of a connection. Yes, definitely. So we can go on and on the behavior part, Matthew. But I want to pick your brains on some other stuff as well. I want to ask you. You've worked for the NGO sector, and you've worked on the commercial brand side, and so on and so forth. How have the two experiences compared, and what would you tell our listeners about that?
Just repeat. Sorry, there was a bit of background noise here. I lost the first part of the question.
You've worked with the NGOs, right? The non-governmental organizations, and you work with the commercial sector, and you've had both sides, right? I mean, for example, in our advertising business, quite often, especially the millennials would ask the question, do we have a purpose, or are we just selling soaps here, right? So, what's your experience been working with the non-government organizations, which we assume is a bit more purpose-led work, and working with the commercial side, and what's your experiences been on both sides of the fence?
I mean, in some ways it is. So one of the interesting things is that when I do presentations, the NGOs are really interested in the commercial examples I give, and the commercial organizations are really interested in the NGO examples I give. I mean, I think, and I'm not saying this tritely, there may not be as much difference as you would expect, because at the end of the day, it's pretty much the same thing. You're trying to make a pathway to behavior easy, natural, and rewarding, whether that is buying a brand, signing up for a subscription, or whether that is making it easier for people who run family planning clinics in East Africa, feel that they can give young women who aren't married access to contraception. And so some of the things, and I say this, there's no, I think sometimes one of the problems is that we tend to think about only using examples that relate directly to the thing that we're trying to do. And I think there's a great benefit in just having a very wide field, both, to look at lab experiments, field experiments, to look at sort of marketing case studies and things like that. I often look at sort of the awards winners to see if I can reverse engineer behavioral insights out of those that may have been intentional, may not have been intentional. And the reason I say that is that sort of every context is different, and even two things that look similar at a contextual level might be different. And the literature is full of things, of research, of experiments that haven't replicated, or field experiments even that haven't worked when applied in another area, because the context is subtly different. And that can be a cultural context. It could be it's in a different country, in a different part of a country. It could be that it's a subtly different choice, but all of those things can really, really change the outcomes. And so one of the things that we have at the moment, an interesting replication crisis, even more potentially even academic fraud in the world of behavioral science, which is being well reported quite broadly. And people often say to me, well, can you, what should we do about these things? And I say, well, from my perspective as a practitioner, and I'm talking generally to marketers or to people who are trying to do behavior change, this is not, what we're not trying to do is recommend something. In fact, would never do is say, this is going to work. This is, again, to go back to Cialdini, the silver bullet. What you're really trying to do is inspire an idea, inspire somebody to take something and develop it, and then, of course, to test it in some way. And to test it as well as they can. But that's the critical thing. It's like, I think, for me, the use of behavioral insights, I'm not a behavioral scientist. I come from a marketing background. My formative years were spent in advertising agencies in London, in Bangkok, and in San Francisco. What we're trying to do is take these things. These are things that may work. Let's experiment. Let's work with them. Let's use them as inspiration for a solution.
Yeah, no, absolutely fantastic. And Matthew, a lot of people hearing us would be right now thinking, how's the transition from being an advertising agency planner to being an entrepreneur to being a consultant been like, right? I mean, is there how's the life after advertising? How's the life for a planner outside of the advertising? So I can't let that chance go away. Yeah.
Well, you're several decades younger than me. No, I mean, I think sort of part of it is you know, when you reach a stage in your career, it's kind of like you really, well, two things I think happened with me. The first is once you start to understand the insights, you know, kind of how to apply behavioral science and what we've learned from it, it's very difficult to go back. It's very difficult to, you know, it is almost like the door has opened too much and you've seen another world. So, you know, it becomes kind of difficult to go back to being an advertising planner in a normal sense where, you know, so I love the independence. I am never, you know, I mean, many people who work as consultants will tell you this. The great thing is you can stick with what you want to say. You can have your principles. You don't have to bend in any way because you're your own boss. But equally, you are often not as involved throughout the process. So the nicest clients I work with, the ones who keep coming back to me, the most delightful thing, and this has happened a couple of times in the last couple of months, is, you know, sort of a project that was meant to go on for 6 weeks has gone on for 3-4 months. You know, kind of so I think one of the big differences is you can pick what you want to do much more easily. I don't feel, because it's my own time, I don't feel bad spending 2 hours in the morning reading some academic papers and reading a couple of books about behavioral science. Where do you put that on your timesheet if you're working in an advertising agency? So I love that freedom. I love the fact that I can sort of, you know, generally get involved with organizations. You can get involved in smaller projects, but especially, I mean, you know, I am a very small consultancy. It's not like I'm Deloitte or something like that. So I can work with a small local organization in San Francisco that's doing work to give access to people who don't have access to social services. It's actually in Marin County, but that would be a difficult thing to choose to do if I was being charged out at 3 times my salary. So it's, I think the freedom is the big thing.
Yeah, that's amazing.
But I have to say, you know, Dheeraj, you're still in an agency. I have great respect for advertising agencies. They taught me a lot of critical thinking. I met some of the most, you know, intelligent, ethical and creative people I've come across in my career in them. And I think, you know, sort of, I hope that advertising agencies manage to keep that ability to attract the slightly oddball people, the people who sort of wouldn't necessarily fit into other organizations, because that is absolutely their key strength.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's what we're trying to build as well, Matthew, here, right? I mean, we've had a much more dramatic and renewed focus on talent, right? So we're trying to recruit different kinds of talent, what I call mutant DNAs. Right, so we're going to campuses. So we've got a huge initiative on the talent piece, because if there's one thing that as an industry we lost in about last 2 decades was on that part.
I agree.
So you're absolutely right. That's one of our biggest you know, focus areas here at Leo Burnett.
Which is a fantastic brand globally as well.
Yes. And I think globally the DNA of Leo Burnett is about people, and it's about you know, championing those crazy ideas and so on and so forth. And I don't think that's been lost. So that's the good part of it.
Dheeraj, I'm going to ask you some questions now. This is a new format for me, but so the first question is not one which is on any list, but it's so except for the business of choice, which is you can't use that, and it may or may not be the book that has given you the most insight about the application of behavioral insights. Which book has done that for you?
I think one of the book which comes to my mind immediately is Dave Trott, right?
Okay, interesting.
Thinking. Yeah, and in a very organic, natural way, I think he kind of navigates a lot of constructs of life, which we put into frameworks. But I found that very organic from the gut and very intuitive. Yeah.
Have you had him on the show?
No, not yet. But I think
you should, because I think the whole idea of simplicity. I mean, you know, I grew up in London in the era when Gold Greenleaf's Trot was like the most. They were the rising aggressive agency.
Yeah.
And a lot of it seemed to relate to simplicity. But
Yes.
I think what they did was they managed to kind of make things simple but didn't lose the interest in the process of doing that. So I think he'd be a great person. I agree with you. I think just also knowing where he's come from, I think it's just fantastic to have a truly creative person who's embraced this notion of, you got to understand how people make choices. You've got to understand how the brain works.
Yeah.
So this is a question I would hate to answer, so I'm not going to even answer it if you ask me it back.
Don't ask me that then.
I'm going to ask it to you. Which is a quote that you turn to when you're feeling low?
Which is the quote which I turn
to? The quote.
Yeah, it's a tough one. So we have, at Leo Burnett, me and my partner Raj, we talk about this imaginary line. So in the morning we wake up and we wear an imaginary T-shirt, which is a line written or saying, "Bring it on." Right. So every morning we get ready and we like, bring it on, right? Because I realized, and Matthew, that there will be very few days which will be very easy and natural. Every day will bring some challenge of its own. And that's really the joy of say, running an agency, because the moment you begin to thrive on the challenges is when the joy begins to happen. If you abhor them, if you kind of hate them, there will be no joy. So bring it on is the quote. I don't know.
So it's almost like a just do it without all the Nike associations.
Yeah.
I would answer this one. So which is one film that never fails to inspire you?
The Dead Poets Society.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And I can see that. It's a very inspirational film. It's sort of, it is Robin Williams playing pretty much a part he played in half a dozen movies, which is the sort of the society misfit who inspires other people. My answer there would be a curious one, and I literally just thought about this as a film. I don't. One of the things, it's interesting, even though familiarity is important, I've only recently started rereading books I've read before, which is a very rewarding thing to do. Wow. And I don't mean just behavioral science books, but other books, and also watching films. We're always looking for the new, forgetting the pleasure that sort of the other ones have brought us, which is an interesting paradox in human nature. We like familiarity, but we also kind of
want something
new things as well. But there's an Australian film called The Castle, and it is a delightful. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't.
It's a delightful film. It's really it's not at all a glossy production. It's a very, very touching film about the importance of home and how somebody might define home. It's just a very heartwarming film that always makes me feel a bit better about human nature if I watch it. And I think I've probably watched it about 4 or 5 times now.
Amazing. I'll go and pick it up. Yeah, that's interesting. Super.
Have we got time for any more?
We could go.
I've got an answer for this one. I'm going to ask you this one, but I have an answer for it as well. I wonder how close our answers will be. Which is the one question you always ask while interviewing potential employees?
Yeah, so one question always, a couple of them, but one of the most revealing ones is, what's your benchmark? What's your benchmark work, right? And I tell them not to tell me things that their bosses liked or whether they succeeded or any of it, but something which gave them joy. Because I want to understand what drives that person, what makes that person happy. And that's always so revealing, Matthew, because the kind of answers I get are never the standard, I like the Dove campaign or any of that. I get answers which are most bizarre. Somebody likes a very, very small thing that they did, but it brought them a lot of joy. It's very revealing about the character and the choices that the person makes. What are the questions you ask?
So one question I ask, and this is, I've interviewed, I don't know how many 100 planners in my career, or aspiring planners, junior planners, senior planners. But a question I started asking was, tell me about a time when somebody said to you, I hadn't thought about it that way before.
Yeah.
And what I'm really doing, rather than asking them about insights, it's almost like, sort of, when did it, and it could be in a discussion with friends, it could be in a creative briefing, it could be with a client. And I think it's an important thing because first of all, it shows that that's what an insight does. And we use the word too loosely, but what an insight does is it makes us think about things in a different way.
Yeah.
If not, it's just an observation. And so so I was looking for that. I would always ask people that, but there's another important part about it as well. And I had a boss once who used to say that the planner should be the smartest person in the room. And I fundamentally disagree with that.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. Yeah. You can't go more wrong than that.
No. If you're trying to be the smartest person in the room,
you're gone.
You can, exactly. But if you ask somebody, when did you say something that made people say, I hadn't thought of it like that before?
Yes.
They're not thinking about you. It's gone inside their head. What they're really saying is, you've moved my mental furniture around a bit. So there's something really interesting in that, but it's not like sort of, hey, that guy's really smart. You've moved. And this is what we have to do. This is what we all do as practitioners. We're essentially moving ideas from one head to another. We're moving thoughts from one head to another.
Yes, that's beautiful.
And so I always use that as a question.
Amazing. Matthew, thank you so much. It's been such a rewarding conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as well.
I hope it was easy, natural, and rewarding.
Yes, absolutely.
As all choices should be. All right, Dheeraj, well, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
If you want to reach me, go to my website, thebusinessofchoice.com, and just contact me through that.